Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching History of a Mediterranean Superpower, Rise and Fall of Venice by Epic History. Now I think I'm going to be learning a lot through this one. You know, the history of medieval to modern Venice, not something I know a ton about, but Epic History, they always do a great job, so I'm really excited to get into it. Before I do, I'd appreciate it if you guys would leave a like on the video, subscribe to the channel, and check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. Now with all that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction.
The extraordinary city of Venice. Queen of the Adriatic. Behind the elegant facade of its famous domes and canals lies the dramatic history of a 1,000-year empire.
Oh, I'm excited.
A maritime republic and formidable naval power. But this great city had unlikely origins.
Oh?
At the height of the Roman Empire, these coastal lagoons were home only to small fishing communities. But in the 5th century AD, the Western Roman Empire was overrun by barbarian tribes.
Yeah, as we see Western Rome fall, of course Eastern Rome remains, but as the West falls, some cities that had previously been pretty important, they become far less important. I mean, Rome itself is a good example. Frankly, by the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the city of Rome had already lost a great deal of its importance. There had been other capitals. The city wasn't much of a military or political hub. Still had symbolic importance. So you saw some of these ancient important cities fall in terms of their prominence, and other cities rise up, right? And so we'll see that history of Venice as it rises, going from sort of late antiquity into the early Middle Ages. And of course, Venice has been a city and a city-state that has been important, influential, powerful for a long time at this point.
As Italy became a battleground for Huns, Goths, Eastern Romans, and Lombards, many sought refuge among the lagoons. In 726, these refugees elected Orso to be their duke or doge, the first in an unbroken line of 117 doges to rule Venice for 1,000 years.
So we see the fall of the Western Roman Empire. You know, a lot of that area sort of falls into chaos, and as we leave antiquity behind and head into the early Middle Ages, Venice arises.
For nearly 200 years, much of Italy was ruled by a resurgent Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire. Its Italian province, known as the Exarchate of Ravenna, fell to the Lombards in 751. Only Venice held out, protected by its lagoons. Answering the Pope's call for aid, Charlemagne and the Franks came to Italy and crushed the Lombards. But they also...
Wow, we're going through a lot of time. We're already seeing that Italy, following the collapse of the Romans, was an area that very much was competed over by a couple of different powerful peoples and states. Right? You've got the Eastern Roman Empire, the Lombards coming in, a whole bunch of different tribes and peoples, then Charlemagne coming in, right? So a rather sort of geopolitically chaotic region being fought over by a lot of different people.
Who failed to take Venice. Charlemagne's son, Pepin, King of Italy, was said to have died from a fever caught in the marshes that surrounded Venice as he tried to attack the city. In the following decade...
Well, that is one of the reasons why some of these coastal cities like a Venice or a Ravenna had began to rise as Rome declined. Right? One of the reasons, there's a couple of reasons why Rome had become less important and some of these cities in northern Italy had grown, right? One is that they were sort of closer to the action, right? You know, the emperors in the late Western Roman Empire often stationed themselves in Ravenna in particular because they were closer to the borders, right? They needed to go out and fight enemies encroaching on their territory, but also these cities were more defensible, often because they were surrounded by these swamps and marshes they're pretty difficult to attack. So we're seeing that with Venice here.
Decades, Venice asserted its independence from the Byzantine Empire, and thanks to its location, flourished as a trading hub between Europe and the East. Venetian merchants sold Italian grain and wine to the great city of Constantinople.
And that's the position Venice is going to be in for hundreds of years after this point, right? It'll be this important trading city, right? In between the East and the West. I mean, in between, we're not saying in the middle, but a city that connected trade lines from a lot of Europe back to Constantinople, the Eastern Roman Empire, even further east, right? And we'll see, all this territory is once part of the Roman Empire, but Venice and some of these other Italian city-states are going to come to have some conflicts with the Eastern Roman Empire. Alliances sometimes, they'll sometimes work together, but there's also going to be some conflicts.
Venetian merchants sold Italian grain and wine to the great city of Constantinople, where they bought spices and silk to sell to Western Europe. Above all, Venice's early success came from the trade of salt, the vital food preservative of the medieval world, harvested from salt pans and lagoons. The Venetians went so far as to describe salt as il vero fondamento del nostro Stato, the true foundation of our state.
I mean, salt, important to them, but also an extremely important item, good in this era of history, right? Some states had taxes on the purchase and use of salt, right? Salt was extremely important in preserving food. So, hey, salt's a good item to be able to trade back and forth. It's important to just about anyone who needs to eat.
In 828, two Venetian merchants visiting Alexandria smuggled the supposed body of St. Mark back to Venice to boost the standing of their home city.
Wow.
The saint's relics were interred in the city's great new church, the Basilica di San Marco. The first basilica was destroyed by fire in 976. Today's cathedral, consecrated in 1094, stands on the same site. St. Mark became the city's patron saint. His emblem, the winged lion, became the symbol of the Republic and decorated its standard. Venetian trade routes to the east were plagued by pirates from the Balkan and North African coasts. So Venice built a navy to drive them from the seas and garrisoned strategic harbors and islands along...
Especially in this era, more generally, right? This is an era when, you have some powerful empires in the region, the Caliphate, the Eastern Roman Empire, but none which truly dominate the entire, or even really the Eastern Mediterranean. What that leaves is sometimes a bit of a power vacuum. And so you see fairly frequent piracy that the Caliphate would have to deal with, the Eastern Romans would have to deal with, the Venetians would have to deal with, and each of these powers would also be, or people from those powers would also be pirates at various times, right? So, hey, they were both trying to defend themselves against piracy, and sometimes doing a little bit of piracy, depending on whose perspective you're using.
to drive them from the seas, and garrisoned strategic harbors and islands along the Adriatic shore. By the year 1000, Doges of Venice were also styling themselves Dukes of Dalmatia. The distinctive Venetian warship was the galley, powered by up to 150 oars, and triangular lateen sails, rigged fore and aft. Weapons included a battering ram and around 30 crossbowmen. Galleys were also used to transport high-value cargo, such as spices, silks, or precious stones. In 1103, construction began of Venice's famous Arsenale, a giant state-owned shipyard that would become one of Europe's largest industrial centers.
Wow.
Employing around 2,000 workmen and turning out hundreds of ships a year.
Well, we're getting a real general history of Venice. I will say, And I'm being more general with my contributions, but I don't know that much specifically about the history of Venice. But I will say northern Italy during this era, and by this era I'm now talking about we're heading into sort of the high Middle Ages, into the late Middle Ages, early thousands, entering in the coming future will be the Renaissance, the early modern period. So these general span of a couple hundred years, these Italian city-states, often in the north, would become quite wealthy from a lot of trade, and they would invest in things like shipbuilding or other industry, right? So they would become real centers of industry, trade, banking at the time, right? These were real centers of this sort of broader economy in this region of northern Italy.
The Arsenali pioneered many modern industrial techniques and underpinned Venetian naval power for centuries. Armed with a powerful navy and lucrative trading concessions from the Byzantine Emperor, Venice rose to become the greatest commercial and naval power in the Eastern Mediterranean. But Venetian power also came through shrewd negotiation and self-interest.
Absolutely. I mean, you can see, you look at a map like this, right? If you're someone who doesn't know the history, and you're just looking at colors on a map, you'd say, well, the Venetians don't seem to control that much territory. Look at the Byzantines, look at the Seljuks, right? But you're missing a big part of the story, right? The Venetians, they control the territory that they most need to control to keep their trade routes going, right? The Venetians have a presence in this entire Eastern Mediterranean region. They are making deals with the Byzantines, sometimes coercing them, sometimes twisting some legs to get what they want, right? So they have a presence through the whole region, and they're becoming very wealthy off of these trade deals that they're making, and then using that to build up their own city, build up their own industry, right? Like I said, Venice, some of these other cities, especially in parts of Italy, northern Italy, they're becoming centers of industry and economy.
This was the age of the Crusades, and Venice was closely involved with Crusader states as allies and trading partners. In 1202, the Fourth Crusade...
Yeah, but put an emphasis on trading partners, right? As allies and trading partners. They really got in there to make some trades, to make some money. We talk about the Crusades. I mean, there's a couple different Crusades, a lot of different people involved. You cannot generalize why each person got involved, right? It's different for everybody. There were some individuals who got involved out of genuine religious conviction. There were some who wanted to claim territory in the Levant, right? Build their base of power, either in the Middle East or in their home country. And there were many who were looking to make a quick buck, right? And for some people, it was a mixture of any number of those three. So once again, you don't want to generalize, but the Venetians, or at least Venice as a whole, it was definitely more in there to get some trade deals, make some money, right, bring some cash back.
Allies and trading partners. In 1202, the Fourth Crusade arrived in Venice, seeking ships to take them to Egypt, but with no money to pay for them. Doge Enrico Dandolo sensed an opportunity. In exchange for loans, he first persuaded the Crusaders to capture Zadar for Venice. Then, relations having soured between Venice and the Byzantines...
And I will say, I didn't point this out earlier, but of course, there's a deep history of Italian influence over the Balkans, especially the Dalmatian coast. So we're seeing some of that connection here.
Byzantines to attack Constantinople itself.
Uh-oh.
In 1204, the world's greatest Christian city was sacked and plundered by self-proclaimed warriors of Christ.
Yeah, this is one of the most notorious moments of the Crusade. Now, I will say, there were some pretty notorious moments when they were raiding and sacking Muslim cities. But I guess it's sort of the irony or the hypocrisy of the whole thing that the Christian Crusaders ended up sacking sort of the grandest Christian city, right? And so this is quite a notorious moment. They do a lot of damage to Constantinople. The city never truly recovers, at least under the Byzantines.
Venice took its share of the loot, including most famously 4 bronze horses from the Hippodrome of Constantine, which found a new home on the facade of St. Mark's Basilica in the center of Venice.
They stole them. They said, yeah, we've come through with the crusade. What we're going to do is sack your city, loot, and included in that looting, take some of your most precious items. So, happy to help. The Byzantines are like, wait a moment, this is not going the way we wanted.
Doge Enrico and the Crusaders carved up the Byzantine Empire between them. Venice got the islands of the Aegean, Crete and the strategically placed ports of Modone and Koroni.
So we've seen, Venice is already taking more territory, especially along the Dalmatian coast, but now they're actually eating up pretty significant chunks of territory here, right? A lot of islands. They have more, of course, control of trade routes, of money, but also more political and territorial power.
Known henceforth as the Eyes of the Republic. Empire brought Venice unprecedented wealth and power, but fueled a bitter rivalry with another Italian maritime republic, Genoa. For more than a century, these two...
when people talk about the sort of Italian trading states or city-states of this era, they are most often thinking of Genoa and Venice. They are by far the two most prominent of that group.
Italian city-states vied for supremacy in the Eastern Mediterranean, their wars ranging from the Levant to Sicily, the Aegean, Black Sea, and Adriatic. During these wars, a Venetian captain named Marco Polo was taken prisoner and used his time in a Genoese jail to dictate an account of his travels in China. The rivalry became a regional conflict, Genoa making alliances with the Habsburg Duke of Austria, the King of Hungary, and Padua. Venice with the revived Byzantine Empire, Cyprus, and Milan.
So now we're getting into the geopolitics, right? These two states are making partnerships with a lot of the countries, empires around them. We're also seeing sort of the precursor to the Age of Exploration. I think the Age of Exploration generally is thought to begin with old Columbus in 1492, but of course that didn't come out of nowhere, and he was Genoese, by the way, right? Before that, we have an era of these European states, sort of Western European, Central European, Mediterranean, generally westmost on the continent, Spain, Portugal, these Italian states, expanding, taking more territory, going further afield, and we'll see sort of the later processes or later parts of that process in this video. But the point I'm making is that you see a lot of this expansion, claiming these trade routes, right? We see a lot of the trends that will continue and will make the Age of Exploration. Of course, that goes sort of much bigger, a much wider scale, but we're seeing a lot of these trends have already started here.
The fortunes of war ebbed and flowed until in 1379, Venice came under attack from land and sea, with a Genoese force occupying Chioggia, just 15 miles south of the city. But Venice miraculously turned the tables, using galleys armed with gunpowder artillery for the first time to trap and capture the Genoese fleet.
Oh, wow.
The wars finally ended in 1381 with the Peace of Turin. Venice had to make significant concessions, and like Genoa, had been exhausted by war. But while Genoa soon fell victim to internal...
Give Dalmatia to Hungary, end alliance with the Greek Emperor and King of Cyprus, recognize Trieste as a free city. Right, so these are some important conditions here. Important, frankly, moments in European politics going forward.
Feuding, Venice would stage an astonishing recovery, thanks in large part to the unique system of government by which the Republic was now ruled.
The most
miraculous city.
Whoa, wait a minute. I always read out the quotes in these videos. I've been upstaged. I'll go back so you can hear it in full. I don't mind sitting here.
The most miraculous city of Venice. Rich in gold, but richer in fame. Strong in power, but stronger in virtue. Built on both solid marble and the harmony of its citizens. Petrarch.
And of course, Petrarch is one of, if not the most famous of these Renaissance scholars. He plays an important part in unearthing, revitalizing a lot of this ancient literature and study, really bringing it to the forefront. So we've got a very important individual here.
While Western Europe was dominated by kings who claimed to rule by divine right, several Italian city-states harked back to classical forms of government, chiefly the idea of the Republic, res publica, the thing of the people. However, at the height of its power, Venice's Republic, La Serenissima as it was known, was firmly in the hands of its nobility.
Yeah.
Only those whose names were listed in the Golden Book, the city's registry of nobility, could join the Great Council.
In a lot of these types of city-states, what we're talking about is often closer to an oligarchy. Now, the power is still more distributed than under, say, an absolute monarchy, but it is still contained, often, within a small group of influential, wealthy, and powerful individuals.
Which appointed all senior officials through a complex system of voting and drawing lots. They chose 40 of their members to form the Quarantia, who supervised economic affairs, and 200 to 300 to form the Senate, the main legislative body, attended in addition by the Republic's admirals, generals, and diplomats. The elected head of government remained the Doge. His powers had been steadily diminished, until by the 1400s, he was no more, Venetians joked, than a tavern sign, a decorative symbol of power, though he continued to wield huge influence. The Republic's day-to-day government was the Signoria, made up of the Doge, the 6 members of his minor council, and 3 representatives of the Quarantia. They could be joined by 3 boards of special advisors, known as the Savi, or wise men, to form the full college. The Council of 10, meanwhile, had a special remit to sniff out subversion. It was a system that eventually acquired so many checks and balances that change, for good or ill, seemed both unimaginable and undesirable.
Yeah, you can sort of imagine how this system develops from some sort of old Republican roots, and then over the hundreds of years the system develops. New branches are added, new groups, new checks and balances, to where you've got this very complex system with a lot of these checks and balances. Any decision has to go through a million people. There's a lot of sort of factions at play, right? It's a complex working government.
The Constitution of Venice, an insuperable monument of wisdom and efficiency. Gasparo Contarini. Over time, an idea developed across Europe that Venice's constitution contained the 3 classical forms of government. Democracy, oligarchy, and monarchy, in perfect balance, and so ensured social harmony and stability.
Interesting.
The myth of Venice, as this became known, overlooked the Republic's healthy tradition of attempted coups, rampant corruption, and social tension. But the Venetians did achieve something rare in the...
It's interesting to think about, the body politic here, because that's what we're talking about, and how the body politic is perfectly balanced between democracy, oligarchy, and monarchy, or at least that's the vision of it. It makes you think, or I draw this connection for maybe no reason, but you think of, say, European medicine at the time, right? The humors, and how do you make someone healthy? You need to balance out their humors, right? Some people may be more heavy on one than another. So balance is, you want to attain balance, right? Balance is important, whether in the humors or in the style of government. Just something that came to mind.
Medieval and Renaissance world. a durable, stable and effective government. The Serene Republic had one further strikingly modern feature. The best diplomats in Europe, skilled ambassadors in every capital and court, sending information back to Venice in secret code from across the continent. Venice would need every advantage, for the years ahead would be dominated by bitter wars with her Italian neighbors and new challenges to her empire.
Yeah, I mean, the era we're talking about, right? I'm talking about this as sort of a precursor to the age of exploration. And this is an era where, obviously, there's a lot of powerful European states, but these Italian city-states, these Italian trading states, they're very rich, they're very powerful politically, they have a lot of these trade routes, they're doing a lot of exploration. I mean, they have a massive leg up, especially in terms of economy, right? And that brings Renaissance, culture, art, literature, the real center of all of these things. Now, as we enter into this next era of European history, the Ottomans take Constantinople, we have the age of exploration, discovery of the Americas, things start to shift. We enter into the early modern period. In some states, like, for example, Portugal and Spain start to become very powerful. You move a little further, states like the Netherlands, and then even a little further, England and France. Now, that's moving pretty far down the line, but a lot of these Italian city-states, not all of them, and I'm not going to say they're necessarily hitting their peak, but they're at a real height of their power, and they're going to have a lot of new challenges to face in the years to come.
You Venetians are very wrong to disturb the peace of other states, rather than to rest content with the most splendid state of Italy, which you already possess. If you knew how you are universally hated, your hair would stand on end. You are alone, with all the world against you.
Damn.
Galeazzo Sforza. For centuries, Venice had stood apart from the territorial wars of her Italian neighbors, focusing instead on her maritime empire.
Right.
But the war with Genoa, and particularly the Genoese occupation of Chioggia, had shown the Venetians that their city was vulnerable. In 1404, she was attacked again by former allies, the Carrara family of Padua.
Damn.
But the Republic assembled a large army from across her empire and was victorious, annexing Padua and conquering Verona.
Whoa. All right, they're starting to build themselves not only a maritime empire, but a land empire. More territory, that can be good. It can also lead to more problems, however.
More gains followed in Friuli. Doge Francesco Foscari, whose 34-year reign was the longest of any doge, was determined that Venice must continue to expand her territory in Italy for her own security.
I mean, and on one hand, you can see how that would make sense from their position. Once again, they're being attacked by their neighbors. Venice begins to feel threatened. They've got this powerful maritime empire, but they need more territory in Italy, in Europe. More buffers around their city, territory to draw soldiers from, manpower. And so now Venice is expanding, as I said, as a land power. So you understand that, but that can also get you into more trouble, right? That can get you into more conflicts with these states around you.
He used the Republic's enormous wealth to hire bands of mercenaries, led by captains known in Italy as condottieri. Their name came from the Italian word condotta, or contract, and they had been an important feature of Italian warfare since the 1300s. Initially, these mercenary bands were led by and made up of foreigners, Catalans, Germans, Hungarians, even Englishmen.
I will say this is a very sort of cosmopolitan era in some ways, not in other ways. I mean, most people who were born would stay in the same place for their entire lives, mostly as farmers, peasants, serfs, whatever they were. But there is, in the modern day and age, we have nation states with borders and all these types of things. Borders were a lot more porous at this time. Nation states, you had a lot of these multi-ethnic states. And so you'll see whether explorers, mercenary captains, politicians, whomever, a bunch of people from a bunch of different ethnicities spread across Europe traveling, right? You see a bunch of foreign mercenaries throughout the entire continent in this period. I mentioned the age of exploration, right? Christopher Columbus is from Genoa, but he doesn't sail across the ocean to find the Americas on behalf of Genoa, right? A lot of these Italian sailors, especially the Genoese, were going and working for other powers, the Portuguese, the Spanish, right? So you have a lot of these people in certain trades. They were going around offering their services to any state or body that was willing to take it and pay for it.
But by the 1400s, Italian condottieri were leading these armies, waging wars on behalf of competing states, and sometimes even conquering Italian states for themselves. Condottieri would often switch their allegiance to the highest bidder. Their soldiers were equally disloyal and notoriously unruly. Since they fought for nothing but personal gain, and often switched sides, they had no interest in slaughter, and so their battles were often theatrical and virtually bloodless affairs.
Oh, that's funny. You've got two sides, both packed with mercenaries or contractors, who, they come up, fight each other a little bit. When one has the upper hand, they basically shake hands and both go home. Because they're both there to make some money. Neither side really wants to die for the cause. So, they don't really want to make it too bloody. Just maybe enough to be believable.
The ambitions of the Venetian Doge and his condottieri put Venice on a collision course with the leading power in northern Italy, the Duchy of Milan. A long war began between the two states and their allies, with the Venetians winning a great victory at Moclodio. In the treaty that followed, Venice gained yet more territory, pushing west past Bergamo to the River Adda. But war soon broke out again. For nearly 3 decades, northern Italy was ravaged by bands of mercenaries. Their leaders were immortalized by the great artists of the day, men such as Francesco Sforza and Bartolomeo Colleoni. Finally, by the Peace of Lodi, Venice secured her Domini di Terraferma, her mainland state, to go with her Stato da Mar, her overseas empire.
Impressive.
40 years of relative peace followed, shattered in 1494, when the King of France, Charles VIII, invaded Italy with a large army.
Uh-oh, the French are getting uppity. I know this is just because the history I'm thinking of is what I'm familiar with, but I can't help thinking about the French Revolutionary Wars and Napoleon. We're seeing a lot of the places he fought. The French are invading. We've got an Italian war. Once again, all that connects them is that I'm familiar with both, but I'm just thinking of that when we see the first Italian war beginning here.
His goal? To enforce his hereditary claim to the Kingdom of Naples. But his actions united even bitter enemies like Milan and Venice against him. The Italian states formed the League of Venice, led by the Borgia Pope Alexander VI, and fought King Charles at Fornovo, but could not prevent his escape back to France. It was the beginning of a long conflict, known simply as the Italian Wars.
Wow, that is a long conflict. I will say, we saw a bit of unification there, but we've talked a little bit recently about Italian unification, Risorgimento, right? The creation of an Italian state, a nation state in the 19th century. I think we're seeing here why that didn't happen sooner, right? There was so much infighting between these different Italian states. They had competing interests. They usually didn't feel that much of a kinship with each other. Occasionally, they banded together to fight off external enemies, but we've seen how at each other's throats they were. One of the reasons why it takes hundreds of years after this to actually form, a modern Italy that we see today.
Which saw northern Italy become the primary battleground in the bitter contest between the kings of France and the Habsburg emperors.
Right, and this is where, in sort of early modern into modern European history, the French and the Habsburgs have been a big presence in Italy. They've had a lot of influence, have sometimes controlled even territory, right, in northern Italy in particular. And so we're seeing some of that history unfold here.
It was fought against the backdrop of the Italian Renaissance and Protestant Reformation.
Right.
A complex and sprawling conflict that would last 6 decades.
Yeah, I've got some spicy stuff happening.
The early display of Italian unity was short-lived. Venice soon switched sides, allying with the King of France against Milan in order to share in the spoils of her defeat. Venetian ambition was now regarded as a major threat by her Italian neighbours. Of these, none was more ruthless than the Pope.
Damn.
Pope Julius II, the man who commissioned Michelangelo.
I mean, hey, we're talking about the Reformation. The Pope is on a high alert. He has seen one of the biggest, the popes of this era have seen unfolding in front of them one of the biggest challenges to their authority that the Catholic Church has ever seen. Maybe, I think, the biggest challenge, right? The Reformation, Protestantism, right? They must feel extremely threatened, and they're going to get pretty cutthroat.
To paint the Sistine Chapel and created the Pope's famous Swiss Guard, was determined to crush Venetian power. Venice, he declared, would be returned to the status of a fishing village.
Oh, damn.
Pope Julius issued a papal decree excommunicating the entire Venetian Republic. A bold move that effectively declared open season on the Venetian state, its assets, and citizens.
Wow.
He also assembled a formidable alliance against Venice, the League of Cambrai, the mightiest ever.
Damn, that is a formidable alliance. And look, excommunicating the entire republic, as we've seen, it's not like Christian states were afraid to fight other Christian states. Even if, I know we're talking about the Reformation, but even Catholic states weren't afraid to fight other Catholic states, right? But excommunicating the entire republic, like he said, you're really setting up open season on Venice. Like, hey, go and attack them, take their stuff, they're out of the church.
Alliance against Venice, the League of Cambrai, the mightiest ever faced by a single Italian state.
Jeez.
Venice faced an existential threat. In 1509, at the Battle of Agnadello, her forces suffered a crushing defeat at the hands of the French king. One contemporary,
Machiavelli,
Florentine diplomat Niccolò Machiavelli, wrote that Venice had lost in one day what it had taken her 800 years to conquer.
Damn.
However, the Italian wars were notorious, not just for their many atrocities, but their shifting alliances, twists and turns.
Right.
Within a year, the Pope had switched sides, forming an alliance with Venice to fight the French.
Well, that seems like a crazy tide shift. Someone's got to tell me down below why the Pope switched. It seems like he was really ready to get in there against Venice, but now he flipped.
Then Venice switched sides, siding with France against the Pope.
What the hell?
Hoping to win a crushing victory over the Pope's Swiss mercenaries at Marignano.
Crazy.
Just 8 years after Venice faced destruction by the League of Cambrai, the Treaty of Noyon restored nearly all her former territories. The Republic had run the gauntlet of foreign powers and formidable alliances. But through sharp diplomacy, political flexibility, and a little good fortune, she had survived. It is the most triumphant city that I have ever seen.
Damn.
Philippe de Comines. Despite the long years of war, the Venetian Republic was a driving force of the Italian Renaissance, and the 15th and 16th centuries were its golden age. Venice was home to great Renaissance painters, such as Giovanni and Gentile Bellini.
And we talked about sort of the style of government and how it was felt to combine oligarchy, monarchy, republicanism, and how this is a style of government a little different than some of the other European states we've seen, somewhat based on that old republicanism, but with a lot of changes over time, right? So this was also an era when a lot of scholars of the Renaissance either rediscovered old Roman texts, or it could have been, and Greek and sort of ancient texts overall, or simply took a new interest in them, right? Now, you don't want to oversimplify this, right? There's sometimes the narrative that Christian Europe has sort of forgotten all of these old texts of antiquity. That's not entirely true, right? Some of them had been lost. Some of them had been lost to the Latins, but had been preserved in the Islamic world. And some of them hadn't been lost, but simply weren't being studied because they were all pagans back in ancient Rome. And some of them remained and were still being studied, right? So there's, sort of a wide range here of how these ancient texts were treated. But it is true that during the Renaissance, some of these old texts and ruins and art is uncovered, and there's regained interest in a lot of these ancient themes. I'm talking more about sort of the scholarly side of it, of the Renaissance. And we can look at people like Petrarch, who we talked about earlier, someone like a Machiavelli, who was mentioned. I know he's the most famous for The Prince, but he was also someone who wrote extensively about ancient republicanism and was an advocate for republicanism himself, right? So there was sort of this interest in ancient political ideals. And of course, we have the artistic side of it here.
Vittorio Carpaccio. Titian. And Tintoretto. Architects like Palladio. And scholars like Francesco Barbaro. He was one of the new humanists who devoted their lives to the rediscovery, study, and sharing of texts from ancient Greece and Rome.
And that's exactly what I was talking about, right? Once again, as I said, it wasn't so simple that when Europe was sort of under the Catholic Church, it simply forgot about everything. But it is true that with the rise of the Renaissance and these humanists, there was a renewed interest in these texts that may have been considered a little too pagan to have been read, or maybe they didn't have much interest put on them, right? There was all these people, vast majority of them are still Catholics, but they have more of an influence on things outside of religion, a tad more secular, a willingness to look outside of traditional church-approved sources, right? So we see some of that in this era.
Venice became a beacon for the greatest European minds of the age. Visitors included the great Dutch philosopher Erasmus of Rotterdam,
another giant of this era,
and the Italian astronomer Galileo, who demonstrated his telescope for the Doge. But Venetians had a reputation as doers rather than thinkers. Their city was renowned as a centre of craftsmanship, producing Europe's finest glassware, as well as silks, cottons, and wood carvings.
Right, a lot of industry in particular.
Nowhere were the city's mercantile and scholarly traditions more brilliantly combined than in the world of printing.
Right.
Doge Cristoforo Moro issued the city's first printing license in 1469. 30 years later, Venice was producing more books than Florence, Milan, Rome, and Naples combined.
Wow. Yeah, it's interesting thinking about sort of the timeline here, which is in this era, Venice is sort of this center of economy, industry, intellectualism, printing. They're really at a height here in a way that you fast forward 100, 200, 300 years, you might think of, if you go into the 1700s, I might think of somewhere like the Netherlands as a center of European printing and industry. You know, and even, of course, you go into the 1700s, you know, England as well. England always likes to separate itself a little bit from the rest of Europe, but you're thinking about growing economy, capital, industry, right? But at this point, we're talking about these Italian states, Venice in particular.
Venice was where Aldus Manutius invented the paperback. He set out to publish every surviving great work from classical Greece.
Nice.
By the end of the 15th century, Venice was the printing capital of the world.
Wow.
Such industry, against a backdrop of a city often described as the most beautiful in the world. The Venetians combined Renaissance architectural ideals with their city's unique lagoon setting and created a masterpiece. The famous Grand Canal, the Rialto Bridge, and the Bridge of Sighs, where prisoners got their last glimpse of the beauty of Venice before descending into its cells.
Damn.
And all along the Grand Canal, the palaces of the city's great merchant families. Because for all its grandeur, business here was never less than cutthroat.
Oh yeah.
Venetian merchants were the most treacherous, lying, thieving scoundrels such as I never believed existed on Earth.
That's funny. I mean, look, we've talked about this more broadly, right? Those Venetian trade deals they secured during the Crusades, right? They were known to be a rather cutthroat bunch, very much focused on business above all else. I will also say on the architecture, right? Venice is one of those places, it's a city that really made their natural environment work for them. You know, I mean, there are some benefits to being located in a place like that. We talked about how in late antiquity, sort of marshes and swamps were better to protect your city, right? In an era of chaos and violence and warfare. But you also face a lot of challenges when you're trying to build outwards. And they made it work. You can think of, you know, a good chunk of the entire country of the Netherlands as well. A country that very much had to fight against nature, against water, in order to survive and inhabit a lot of the territory they claimed.
According to one visitor, the German printmaker Albrecht Dürer. Do not awake our terrible sword, for we shall wage most cruel war against you everywhere. Neither put your trust in your treasure, for we shall cause it suddenly to run from you like a torrent. Beware, therefore, lest you arouse our wrath.
Scary.
Ottoman Sultan Selim II.
I mean,
the Signoria of Venice.
We've gotten into the 14, now we're into the early 1500s, right? So we're in an era when the Ottoman Empire has expanded greatly. It has become this powerful empire. You know, it's expanded Middle East. I don't know how... I mean, I don't have an exact map of the Ottoman Empire in my head, but of course, at its fullest extent, the Ottoman Empire has territory in North Africa, the Middle East, and Europe, right? The Balkans in particular. And in this era, I can say, the Ottoman Empire holds a lot of territory in the Balkans. It has sort of become the dominant power of the region that it controls, right? Balkans into that Middle East, expanding into North Africa, sort of this Eastern Mediterranean region. And of course, that's where Venice does most of its business, right? That's where it's bringing the goods from that it sells back throughout Europe. And so, you know, I'm sure you very much worry about a clash between these two.
While Venetian culture flourished, across the seas her empire faced a new and terrible...
There we go, we got a map of the Ottomans during this era. So we're actually still talking about an Ottoman Empire that controls Anatolia and then a good chunk of the Balkans, but hasn't yet expanded because you, like I said, you look at the full map of the Ottoman Empire at its height, you're talking about expanding all the way down into the Middle East, into North Africa.
Threat. In 1453, the Byzantine Empire, which Venice had helped to weaken 2 centuries before, fell to the Ottoman Turks.
Yeah, I mean, the Byzantines can thank a lot of people for their downfall. Of course, the Ottomans are the ones who actually take them down, but they can thank the Venetians, Genoa, right? These other Italian city-states, but also European states who frankly preyed on their downfall, sacked Constantinople, right? They did not help the Byzantines in the end.
Initially, the relationship between Venice and the Ottomans was businesslike. Venetian merchants were allowed to remain in Constantinople, with the same trading privileges they'd always had under the Byzantine Empire.
Initially.
But there could be no illusions about the Turks' next target. Ottoman Sultan Mehmed the Conqueror had the Venetian Empire firmly in his sights.
Uh-oh.
The onslaught was not long in coming. Argos and Negroponte fell first, as Venice struggled to defend her empire against Ottoman military might. This conflict would last, on and off, for more than 2 centuries. The Venetian fleet, once so dominant, was overwhelmed by Ottoman naval forces, led by skilled admirals such as Heredin Barbarossa. By 1500, even the twin eyes of the Republic, Modone and Corone, had been put out.
Yeah, the Ottomans have shown up and they mean business, right? They ain't here to play.
Successive doges could only watch on, powerless, as the Venetian power base in the east crumbled. In 1570, the Ottomans came for Cyprus. The garrison of Famagusta only surrendered after an 11-month siege. In violation of the terms of surrender, the Venetian commander, Marcantonio Bragadin, was flayed alive.
Ouch.
After a century of Venetian defeats, efforts to form a Christian alliance against the Ottomans finally paid off, and the Holy League, led by Venice and Spain, sent a powerful fleet.
Yeah, Venice is like, hey guys, remember how we used to do all those crusades? Could we maybe get another Christian alliance going? Because we are currently losing all of our territory that we rely on to maintain our trade network. Come on, man. And of course, you look at this network, we've got Spain in it, right? Spain is now has become a very powerful European state, right? They've conquered a lot of American territory. They've sent, especially from the Potosi mines, massive amounts of silver back. They've become very, very wealthy and thus very powerful.
East. They met the Ottomans in the greatest galley battle in history.
Oh yeah,
at
Lepanto.
The Venetians, fired on by their desire to avenge Bragadin's terrible death, led the Christian fleet to a stunning victory. But for all its fame, Lepanto did little to shift the balance of power in the Mediterranean. The Ottoman onslaught had been merely blunted.
Yeah, this is a very famous naval battle, and rightfully so, but the Ottomans aren't done yet, right? They keep going.
Not defeated. The Dominion of Crete is Italy's outer defense, the gate whereby the insidious force of the Turk may penetrate, to the great hurt of the major part of Europe. Venetian ambassador Giovanni Sagredo to Oliver Cromwell.
Didn't think Cromwell would be mentioned.
A period of peace followed, but Venice was now a fading power.
Yeah.
The Republic's prestige had always been linked.
As I said, we're talking about an era, I've been talking about sort of periodization, right? And how in this sort of late Middle Ages into early modern, these Italian city-states, like in this video, Venice in particular, they're sort of at the height of their power and wealth in particular. Really, everything derives from the wealth they make from these trade deals, but they're really at the height of their power, wealth, influence, culture, and by culture, I just mean sort of cultural production and influence over the rest of Europe, right? Not to say that they didn't have culture after this, but they're really at a peak as we enter into this new era. New powers arise. Okay, now you can see on the bottom of the map, look how much the Ottomans have expanded. They control basically all of the Balkans, almost all of the Balkans. They've got that northern African territory. The Ottomans have become extremely powerful. Spain has arisen as a seriously major power from all that silver they managed to get and the territory they've managed to conquer. As we head into the next century, well, Portugal as well, right? They become very powerful from colonization. As you go from the late 15 into 1600s, which is what we're doing now, the Netherlands begin to become a powerful state. Keep moving down that line, right? France and England takes them a little longer, but Venice is on the decline as other powers begin to rise.
Venice was now a fading power. The Republic's prestige had always been linked to her dominance of the seas.
Exactly.
But this was in steep decline. Crucially, she'd fallen behind in shipbuilding technology.
Uh-oh.
While Venice clung on to her old galleys, Portuguese and Spanish captains sailed their caravels and carracks out into the Atlantic.
And this is why I've been talking about this so much, because it's so relevant to the rest of this history. The Portuguese and the Spanish, their caravels, right? These ships, they sail across the Atlantic. The age of exploration begins. Of course, the real beginning of this is first attempted to do some exploration around Africa and the sort of near Atlantic, and then they go all the way through to the Americas, begin conquering territory, sending back goods, sending back silver. They become very powerful. And once again, we see the power shifting from these states like Venice as they lose access to a lot of their trading routes, right? Because of the Ottoman Empire, right? And they don't necessarily hop on this train of colonization out in the Atlantic. They don't have a great opportunity to. And so they get outmoded by a lot of these other European powers on the up and up.
Pioneering new sea routes west to America and east to India and East Asia.
Yeah.
For centuries, the wealth of Venice had relied on eastern trade via the Byzantine and then Ottoman empires. Now, she had been cut out. And while Venice fought costly wars in Italy and the Mediterranean, the city was repeatedly ravaged by plague. The Black Death of 1348 was the first, but outbreaks in 1575 and 1629 were almost as lethal, each killing about a third of the city's population.
Damn.
The government did what it could to prevent the spread of infection. Residents were ordered to stay home, though an exception was made for the funeral of the city's most famous artist, Titian. New arrivals had to isolate themselves aboard ship for 40 days. The quarantena. That's the origin of quarantine.
Yep. I mean, hey, they're working out new methods to try and deal with this plague, but especially in an urban environment like this, there's only so much they can do to handle the sickness that's spreading through the population.
With Venice weakened by war and plague, the Ottomans sensed an easy victory. In 1645, they attacked Venice's last major overseas possession, Crete. The Republic rallied. Funds were raised from the nobility, and appeals went out to the crowned heads of Europe to fight once more for Christendom. But this time, Venice would stand alone.
See, when you hear appeals went out to the crowned heads of Europe, you know you're in a bad spot, right? I mentioned the Crusades last time. This is exactly what the Byzantines did, right? They called to the Western Christians, the church, please come and help us, right? I mean, not to say that's a bad move, but that shows you're in a bad position, that you can't help yourself. And at the time, Venice was one of those powers that responded, and frankly, over the course of a couple crusades, took advantage of the Byzantine situation. But now it's Venice's turn, right? They're saying, hey guys, come and help us, right? Because they're no longer powerful enough to defend themselves against the Ottomans.
Most of Crete was quickly overrun. But under the leadership of Francesco Morosini, said to always enter battle with his cat by his side, the port of Candia mounted a heroic resistance that was to last 21 years.
Yeah, this
One
is
of the longest sieges in history.
sort of a kind of famous event just for the length of it.
Simultaneously, an epic struggle raged across the Aegean Sea. Venetians and Ottomans now almost equal in naval power. Ultimately, the Venetians on their own could not save Crete. In 1669, with many thousands dead and the city in ruins, Candia surrendered to the Ottomans. After 465 years of Venetian rule, Crete had finally fallen.
Wow, that long. I mean, now that I think about it, it makes sense, but I wouldn't have thought it was that long, to be honest. Wow.
15 years later, Venice and Doge Morosini had their chance for revenge. In 1683, the Ottomans were defeated at the gates of Vienna.
Yeah.
And Venice joined the grand counteroffensive.
And this, of course, is another very famous moment. I mean, through this whole history, we've covered a lot of very famous, important moments. This is famous as it's sort of the high watermark of the Ottoman Empire's expansion. Now, the Ottomans, they've got some good times to come. They're still a very powerful empire, but they will not expand into Europe past this point, right? They've reached their furthest extent, at least in that direction.
Known as the Great Turkish War. Morosini led an expedition that recaptured Lefkada and the Greek Peloponnese, then known as the Morea.
Wow.
But during the Venetian siege of Athens, one of their shells hit the Parthenon, where the Ottomans were storing ammunition. The resulting explosion tore through the 2,000-year-old temple, smashing columns and collapsing the roof.
Damn.
Venice's restored empire in Greece did not last long. By 1714, the Ottomans had recovered sufficient.
Yeah, the Venetians with allies, you know, they may have enough power to claw back some territory briefly, but you can see the way the wind is blowing, right? The Ottomans, while, like I said, they've reached their high water mark, very powerful empire, they're growing, if not at least stagnant. The Venetians, they're on the decline. Even if they can take back some territory temporarily, it's just not going to last.
To launch a swift campaign that reconquered the Morea. This, the seventh war between Venice and the Ottoman Empire, would prove the last. The reason was simple. Venice was no longer a Mediterranean power.
No, wow. Of course, when you think about, you know, the sort of rivals of the Ottoman Empire in this era, at least on the European side, you're going to start thinking about Austria, Russia, right? Those are some of the big European powers, over time, especially Russia, who are going to begin to push the Ottomans back, along with, of course, you know, revolution and rebellion from within their empire. You're not thinking of Venice. Venice is now, I guess, an Adriatic power rather than a sort of Eastern Mediterranean empire.
She is reduced to a passive existence. She has no more wars to sustain, peaces to conclude, or desires to express. A mere spectator of events, in her determination to take no part in events, she pretends to take no interest in them.
Damn.
Count Paul Daru.
Venice isn't getting invited to the party anymore. And Venice is doing the, well, I didn't want to go anyway.
The 18th century saw Venice continue to shine as a cultural beacon, a city that dazzled visitors with its canals, churches, opera, and art. Bereft of empire, Venice crystallized into a state of glorious, luxurious stagnation.
Yeah, Venice then, now there's a lot of events to go through between then and today, and there will be more important political events to get through, but Venice is sort of entering into its modern state, which is a city which has far less political importance than it once did. You know, on the grand global stage, it has very little. but it's a city that's well known for its art, its history, its culture, its architecture, known as a very beautiful city worldwide, right? So it's still a city that's known. It's got a good reputation, right? People love it, but it's not known for being a powerful or necessarily politically important city anymore.
Rigidly conservative, incapable of reform. Industry, commerce, and military power were neglected. So when the French Revolutionary Wars turned northern Italy into a battleground once more, Venice was ripe for picking. In 1796, a young French general named Napoleon Bonaparte.
They always do a young French general, I wonder who? Napoleon Bonaparte. But I talked about this earlier. We've got another First Italian War, this time led by Napoleon.
Backed by a powerful army,
Or Italian
demanded
campaign.
the Republic's surrender. There was nothing the Doge and Great Council could do but accept his terms.
And it's sort of funny, we talked about throughout the Middle Ages, Venice's government, not that it appeared super advanced or like of the future, but that it was different than a lot of the monarchies throughout Europe. Some considered it maybe a more enlightened way of doing government, It was sort of an adaptation of an older system, but there were those things to say about it. Versus, in that moment, the government of Venice looks like something of a bygone era. It's inflexible, unable to respond or change, versus the sort of fresh new revolutionary government of France, right? So Venice is in a very different position.
The French, assisted by Italian revolutionaries, tore down symbols of the Ancien Régime and La Serenissima's proud history as an independent republic. The horses of St. Mark were among hundreds of artworks crated up and sent to Paris.
Which was, a lot of looting was done, right? And it was seen as an outrage, rightfully so, right? A lot of Venetian stuff has been looted by the French, who looted just about everywhere they went. But I always thought that one was ironic, since the Venetians stole them in the first place from Constantinople.
Feast of Liberty, the insignia and robes of the last Doge, and the famous Golden Book were brought to the Piazza San Marco and burned.
Damn, they weren't playing.
1,000 years of Venetian independence was at an end. Venice was awarded to Austria in 1797, later incorporated into Napoleon's Kingdom of Italy, and then, after his defeat, returned to Austria as part of the Kingdom of Lombardy-Venetia.
You can imagine Venice was quite the prize. Now, as we've said, it was no longer super politically important. In Italy it was, and in these negotiations it was, but grand scheme, not so much. But, for the Austrians or whatever state it was being absorbed into, as I said, it was a city of great culture and history, and it was, like I said, sort of a nice prize to take.
But Venetian patriotism had not been completely snuffed out. In 1848, inspired by revolutions across Europe, its citizens rose up against the Austrians, declaring the formation of the Republic of San Marco. Austria gradually regained control of its Italian territories. But Venice, aided by its old ally, the sea, held out longest. The Austrians even tried floating balloons carrying bombs into the city.
Wow.
The world's first aerial bombardment, though results were disappointing.
Jeez. And you gotta remember, now this is 1848, there's a lot of revolutions, revolts throughout Europe, and though the idea of sort of Italian unification, Risorgimento, is one that's sort of new onto the scene, the Venetians, right, it hasn't been that long since they had their independence. They're an independent republic, right? It's been a couple decades, so only some of the older among them will remember it, but it's still within living memory of some, and even to those who were born afterwards, which a lot of the young revolutionaries were, it's still within memory, right? It hasn't been that long. It's not like they've been under Austrian domination at least explicit Austrian domination for hundreds and hundreds of years, and they can't possibly imagine their independence. No, they were an independent state not so far ago, right? So it's not that hard for them to imagine being independent once again. Now, as I said, the idea of unifying with the other states of Italy, that one's a bit of a new one. People are going to have to learn to accept that. It's becoming a popular idea, but the idea of breaking away from the Austrians, that's not a crazy one. That's one that a lot of those people want to do in Venice.
After a 17-month siege, Venice surrendered and returned to Austrian control. But the 1848 revolutions had stoked the flames of Italian nationalism and desire for unification. The dreams of the Risorgimento were realized in the 1860s.
There we go.
And Venice became part of a new national state, the Kingdom of Italy. Though its empire is long gone, the splendor of Venice endures. It has remained a magnet for artists and poets. Its light and lagoon fascinating painters like Turner and Monet. Its romantic waterways seducing writers from Lord Byron to Ernest Hemingway. Now, La Serenissima faces the challenges of mass tourism and rising seas.
True, yeah. And those are two big challenges, right? They got to deal with maintaining their city, its architecture, especially the older architecture, against one, as they said, mass tourism. But two, frankly, the more existential threat are those rising sea levels, right? For a lot of cities, even countries, especially islands around the world that are, low, close to that sea level, it's a big problem. For a city like Venice, so closely integrated, right, with its lagoons and the water and the ocean, the Adriatic, I should say, that's something they're going to have to figure out.
Venetians are fighting back where they can, successfully pressuring authorities to reroute the largest cruise ships.
Yeah, I remember that was a big political issue.
And limit the size of tourist groups. But Venice now finds itself on the front line of the global climate crisis.
Yeah.
There are fears that it could be engulfed by the sea before the end of the century.
Yeah, there's, like I said, a lot of places around the world, You can look at, I think of in the United States, places like Miami, a lot of places throughout Florida that are at big risk of being sunk under the water. I'm laughing, but it's very serious, so I don't know. We're going to have to work something out.
This extraordinary city, the center of a powerful maritime empire that lasted more than 1,000 years, has more battles to come.
True. With nature. Well, not really.
If you can't
More
wait
like our impact on nature.
for your next fix of epic history, then head over to Nebula, where you can watch our brand new Battle of the Nile video right
How
now.
about that? This video came out a little bit ago. Alright, so they are promoting their Nebula. So, hey, go check that out. I'll leave their video linked below. Go give them a like. Check out their Nebula, right? All that good stuff. Show Epic History support for making these fantastic videos. So yeah, that was another great one. I definitely learned a lot in this one. It depends on the video. Some videos I know more or less. This was definitely one where my knowledge was a lot more general, and I definitely learned a lot of specifics in this one. Even though, of course, this was an extremely broad video. We did a very broad history of Venice here, but I enjoyed it a lot. There's a lot of fascinating stuff here. We got to talk about politics, culture, art, Renaissance, religion, war, really all these different topics through the history of one city-state. So yeah, I had a great time with this one. If you guys did, I'd appreciate it if you'd like this video, subscribe to the channel, and check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. With all that out of the way, I hope you guys are all having a good day today, and I'll see you all again next time. Goodbye.